The third house is known as the house of the goddess, and it is traditionally called Dea. And the reason why the third house is called Dea, or the house of the goddess, is because the third house is the terrestrial house of joy of the moon. Therefore, the moon loves being in the third house. The moon revels when she's in the third house. The third house is a wonderful place for the moon to be. Now, when we speak about the third house, the fundamental thing we learn about it from a traditional astrological perspective is that the third house is associated with our siblings. Because if we apply the Chaldean order of the 7 classical planets to the houses, we end up with Saturn giving us our physical body in the first house, Jupiter giving us wealth and abundance in the second house, and Mars giving us our blood relationships in our third house. Therefore, the third house is signifying our siblings, but it's also signifying our extended family and our kin and our blood relatives who create the first community that we plug ourselves into within this lifetime. And that is the reason why the third house has to do with siblings. It has nothing to do with Gemini being the third sign of the zodiac. Which brings me to a very important point. Within traditional astrology, the houses represent one complete hermetically sealed topic. The signs of the zodiac represent one complete hermetically sealed topic. This idea of something being hermetically sealed means that it is complete within itself. There is no bleed over between the significations of the signs of the zodiac and the significations of the houses whatsoever. And the only place where we find this bleed over occurring is within the topic of astrological melothesia. Melothesia is the traditional term for medical astrology. Melothesia has to do with us ascribing planets to various systems and parts of our physical body. So the only place where we find a bleed over between what the signs signify and what the houses signify is within astrological melothesia, where we are saying, yes, Mercury is representing the arms, the hands, and our upper extremity, and so is the third house. But beyond that, there is nothing about Gemini as a sign of the zodiac that we ascribe to the third house, because the signs represent one complete topic by themselves, and the houses represent one complete topic by themselves. The point of all of this is that when we're learning astrology, we want to make sure that we're learning astrology as it is, not as we envision it to be, not as we want it to be, because when we force Gemini to mean the third house and the third house to mean Gemini, we prevent ourselves from participating in a more nuanced astrological discussion when we have distinct things to say about Gemini by itself and distinct things to say about the third house by itself. So the point of the matter is, the third house is the house of our siblings because Mars is the god of our brethren or our blood relatives, and that's why we ascribe that topic to the third house. The third house is also the house of short journeys. And the reason for this is because Mars, once again, is the god of pilgrimages. Therefore, we associate the topic of short journeys with the third house because Mars is representing our blood relatives as well as this idea of pilgrimages in general. Similarly, the moon is a goddess of short journeys, and we know that she is making her sojourn through the 12 signs of the zodiac in the shortest amount of time as well. And we know that the moon is having her terrestrial house of joy in the third house. So these are the reasons why we derive these meanings for the third house from the moon being in her terrestrial house of joy in that house, and also from Mars being the god of our brethren as well as our short journeys. Now, every house has planets that have an analogous relationship to that house, and the third house is no different. The planets that we prefer to see in our third house are clearly going to be the benefics, because the benefics are planets that we prefer to see in any house in general. So we love seeing Jupiter in our third house. We also love seeing Venus in our third house because they give us harmonious relationships between our siblings, especially if other things within our chart confirm this to be the truth. The moon, clearly, we love to see in our third house as well, because that is the moon's terrestrial house of joy, And very often when we have the moon in our third house, that can indicate that we have an early community or an early childhood environment that felt nurturing and loving and kind, or that can be what we perceive to be the relationship between ourselves and our siblings, especially if other things within the chart support that, and especially if the moon herself is doing well within that house. Mercury, we also love to see in the third house because the third house, being the house of our siblings and our community, is also the house of the formative education that we experience as children. Therefore, I consider the third house to be a house of early childhood education. And very often when a person is having Mercury in their third house, it makes them somebody who is skillful in terms of anything intellectual. It makes them a little bit of a bookworm, but it also makes them somebody who enjoys being in discourse and in discussion. And that might be something that they end up pursuing professionally. The North Node in the third house is also a good indication because the North Node in any house is really a good indication in terms of what that house is representing. The planets that we don't like to see in the third house are going to be the modern planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto because we just don't like them. Having Pluto in the third house can oftentimes indicate an early childhood story of trauma in terms of one of our siblings. Sometimes people have Pluto in their third house when they had a sibling that died very early in life that they never knew about because their parents never spoke about it. And later on in life, they find out that, oh, wow, I have a sibling. There was something that recently popped across my screen on social media of this guy who had a fridge in his house for the last 50 years because his mother told him not to throw it out. And in the back of the freezer was this container, and his mother told him not to touch the container. After she died, he decided to touch the container. And lo and behold, there was a not so bouncing baby boy in this container in the back of his freezer. That is a Pluto in your third house sort of thing for your mother to freeze your sibling in the freezer and tell you not to touch it. And then you find out later on when she's dead that, oh my God, there was 3 of us living in this house this whole time. That is Pluto in your third house. Now, especially if there are other things going on in the chart to confirm that, that's how that could manifest. Having Neptune in the third house can oftentimes be an indication that you have a sibling who's unwell or that you have a sibling who's navigating some form of addictive tendency within their lives, especially if you have other things in that third house to corroborate that, such as the South Node. Neptune and the South Node in the third house is oftentimes an indication of the sibling that's unwell, the sibling who has a handicap, or the sibling who needs to be taken care of even long into their adulthood. Uranus in the third house can make your sibling a very erratic, anxious person, and it can make the topic of your siblings be a topic of anxiety and general. If you have siblings, I'm speaking about this as if you have siblings. Saturn in the third house can make the topic of early childhood education be a very challenging topic for you. You probably hated school, and you probably didn't like associating with people in your school. It can also make the topic of your siblings in general be one of your larger sources of learning and karma that needs to be burnt off within this lifetime. The sun in the third house isn't actually bad at all. Very often when a person has Leo on the cusp of their third house and they also have the sun in the third house, that person has one sibling. And the reason for that is because there's only one sun and the sun doesn't really like more suns around it. So that person usually has one sibling. That sibling tends to be a boy or it tends to be a male child, and that sibling may take up all of the attention. This is when we have Leo on the cusp of the third house or the sun ruling the third house, and in the third house, this oftentimes ends up being the case. And this idea that having the sun in the third house, it somehow decreases the amount of siblings that we have is something that we're going to revisit when we talk about the fifth house as well. Because very often having the sun in the fifth house as well can also be one of the indications of a person having few children within this lifetime. This is something that we find within Jyotish or Indian astrology, where there's this thought that having Mars or the sun in the fifth house can burn up the fertile moisture necessary for us to proliferate and have many children. But we'll get there when we get there. Mars in the third house, traditionally speaking, was a sign that you would get ambushed on the road. And in the 21st century, we call getting ambushed on the road getting mugged. It's a sign that you're going to get ambushed on the road. You're probably going to get all of your possessions stolen because Mars in the third house places criminals in your third house, basically. And so it can be a sign of being burglarized while on some short journey. So that's one of the things we have with Mars in the third house. Mars in the third house can also represent that you have a contentious relationship with your siblings, and it could also represent that you have a contentious relationship with your early childhood education in general. You didn't like those teachers, and those teachers didn't like you. So that's what it means to have Mars in the third house.